Right now, deep beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, something enormous is building. Scientists are watching it happen in real time, and some of them are using words they almost never use in public. Words like unprecedented, words like uncharted territory. They are describing a climate event so powerful it could reshape weather across the entire United States, not just for one bad season, but potentially for years afterward. This is not science fiction. This is a real forecast from real climate scientists tracking a real phenomenon building in the ocean right now. Let's break down exactly what this is, why it has scientists so alarmed, and what it could actually mean for the country in the months ahead. The phenomenon in question is called El Niño. If you have heard that term before, you probably think of it as just another weather pattern, something meteorologists mention on the news every few years. But what is developing in the Pacific right now is not a typical El Niño. According to the most recent forecast from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the chance of a full El Niño event emerging this year now sits at 61%. That alone wouldn't be shocking. What is shocking is the intensity scientists believe this particular event could reach. NOAA is now giving a 1 in 4 chance that this El Niño reaches what scientists call very strong intensity, a threshold so extreme it earns its own nickname, a Super El Niño. This is not hype. This is an actual scientific classification, and it has only been reached a handful of times in all of recorded history. Just 3 times, to be exact. Once in 1982 and 1983, once in 1997 and 1998, and once more in 2015 and 2016. Each of those events triggered droughts, floods, and record-breaking temperatures across multiple continents simultaneously. One climate scientist tracking this event closely, a professor of atmospheric science at the university at Albany, said he now believes there is roughly a 50% chance this developing El Niño becomes the strongest ever recorded. Just a few weeks earlier, he had put that number at only 20%. That is an enormous jump in a very short window of time, and it tells you just how quickly the situation has been intensifying beneath the ocean's surface. So what exactly is happening down there? El Niño is driven by the warming of surface waters in the tropical Pacific Ocean. Under normal conditions, trade winds blow steadily from east to west, pushing warm water away from South America and toward Asia. But every few years, those winds weaken, or sometimes even reverse entirely, allowing all of that built-up heat to come rushing back eastward along the equator. A Super El Niño happens, when sea surface temperatures in a key stretch of the central Pacific rise more than 2 degrees Celsius above normal, which works out to roughly 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound like much, but across an ocean basin that size, it represents an almost unimaginable amount of stored heat energy. This year, scientists observed something specific that caught their attention. A series of extraordinarily powerful westerly wind bursts swept across the Pacific, pushing a massive reservoir of accumulated warm water eastward toward the equator. Researchers say the closest historical parallel is a wind event from early 1997, the exact kind of event that came right before what was likely the strongest El Niño of the entire 20th century. And according to the scientist tracking this pattern, the warm water building up this year is actually about 0.5 degree warmer than what was recorded at the same point back in 1997. In his own words, the ocean has basically already been hit with all the momentum needed to push this event beyond the intensity level achieved nearly 3 decades ago. Now, nothing about this is completely locked in yet. Future shifts in wind patterns could still partially weaken the developing event before it fully forms. But according to the same researcher, based on decades of historical data about trade wind surges, it would now take an extraordinarily rare event, something beyond the 99th percentile of intense trade wind activity, to stop this El Niño from becoming extremely strong, rather than just moderately strong. In plain terms, a very powerful El Niño now looks almost certain. The only real question left is whether it breaks the all-time record. Let's talk about what an event like this actually does once it fully forms, because the effects reach almost every corner of the planet. Normally, wet regions can become dry and prone to fire. Normally, dry regions can become soaked with rain and prone to flooding. Fish populations off the coast of Peru tend to collapse as warm water disrupts the nutrient-rich currents they depend on. Monsoon rainfall across India, China, and much of Southeast Asia often gets suppressed, affecting agriculture for hundreds of millions of people. Barely any region on Earth escapes some kind of disruption. Here in the United States specifically, the effects tend to follow a fairly consistent pattern during strong El Niño years, and scientists expect this developing event to follow that same broad pattern, just amplified. This summer, more rain is expected to hit the Midwest and the West, while drier conditions stretch from the Gulf Coast all the way to the East Coast. As winter approaches and the El Niño becomes more firmly established, it tends to strengthen what meteorologists call the southern storm track, which brings heavy rain sweeping across the entire southern half of the country, from California all the way to the East Coast. According to the same climate researcher, both the 1982 event and the 1997 event were, in his own words, incredible flood years across the United States. If this developing El Niño matches or exceeds the intensity of those two historic events, we could be looking at a winter season defined by repeated severe flooding across huge portions of the southern United States. At the same time, the northern tier of the country typically runs warmer than usual during a strong El Niño winter, which sounds pleasant on the surface, but often comes with its own set of complications for agriculture, water supply planning, and winter infrastructure that isn't designed for those kinds of temperature swings. There is one silver lining scientists have pointed to. A strong El Niño tends to increase wind shear over the Atlantic Ocean, which can suppress hurricane formation during the Atlantic hurricane season. Fewer hurricanes making landfall would obviously be a welcome relief for coastal communities. But that single benefit is measured against a much longer list of disruptions playing out simultaneously across the rest of the country, from flooding rains in the south to warmer, drier conditions elsewhere. Now here's where this story moves from simply intense to genuinely unprecedented. Because 2026 isn't just any year for the climate. Global temperatures are already running more than 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a baseline far higher than during any of the previous 3 Super El Niño events in recorded history. Layering an extremely powerful El Niño on top of a climate system already running, this hot pushes the entire planet somewhere it has never actually been before in modern human history. A climate scientist at the University of California put it bluntly: humanity has never experienced a strong or very strong El Niño event happening alongside pre-existing global conditions this warm. Because of that, she said it would not be surprising to see genuinely unprecedented global impacts by later this year and into next year, specifically involving flood extremes, drought extremes, and wildfire extremes all occurring together. She went even further, suggesting that either this year or next year, quite possibly both, stand a good chance of setting brand new global temperature records, continuing an unsettling pattern that has repeated itself again and again in recent years. Wildfires deserve particular attention here because the combination of a Super El Niño with already elevated baseline temperatures creates conditions that could increase the risk of widespread or unusually intense fires, even in regions that don't typically experience serious fire activity. Normally damp regions like the Amazon rainforest and parts of Oceania could become vulnerable in ways rarely seen before, with researchers specifically warning about peatland fires in these regions, which once ignited are notoriously difficult to extinguish and can smolder underground for months at a time. But perhaps the most alarming part of this entire story isn't about what happens during the event itself. It's about what happens after. A study published in Nature Communications back in December of 2025 examined all 3 previous Super El Niño events on record, combined with modern climate modeling, and found something deeply concerning. Events of this intensity significantly increase the likelihood of what researchers call climate regime shifts, meaning abrupt, persistent transitions in temperature patterns, ocean surface conditions, and soil moisture that can last for years, or even decades, long after the El Niño itself has completely faded away. Under current global warming trends, that same study found this particular effect would be dramatically amplified compared to previous historical events. The regions expected to be hit hardest by these lasting shifts include the central North Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, East Africa, the Amazon, Central Australia, and the maritime regions surrounding Indonesia. In other words, a 2026 Super El Niño might not simply fade away and let global weather patterns snap back to normal once ocean temperatures eventually cool down again. Some of these changes could genuinely lock in place, becoming a new normal rather than a temporary disruption. It's worth pausing here to really sit with that idea because it's the single most important takeaway from this entire story. We are potentially not just talking about one intense, difficult year. We could be talking about a climate event that permanently shifts weather patterns across huge portions of the globe, including areas directly relevant to American agriculture, water supply, and regional climate stability for years or even decades into the future. That said, it's important to approach this with appropriate scientific caution, and even the researchers involved want that caution clearly communicated. The same University at Albany scientist who tracked the developing wind patterns urged people not to overstate the long-term conclusions just yet. With only 3 Super El Niño events ever recorded in modern history, the statistical foundation for predicting exactly what happens afterward remains genuinely limited. He specifically cautioned that scientists shouldn't have overwhelming confidence about whether we're looking at supercharged global warming effects lasting for the next decade, or simply an intensified effect lasting just a year or 2 before things settle back down. That kind of honest uncertainty is actually one of the more reassuring aspects of how this story has been covered by the scientists actually studying it. Nobody serious in the scientific community is claiming to know exactly how this will unfold. What they are saying, consistently and clearly, is that the underlying conditions building in the Pacific right now are genuinely unusual, historically speaking, and that we are heading into this specific event with a climate system running hotter than at any other point in the post-industrial era. That combination alone justifies serious attention, even without certainty about every downstream consequence. There's also an ecological perspective worth including here, because it adds some important nuance. El Niño events aren't inherently unnatural or purely destructive forces. Ecosystems around the Pacific and beyond have actually evolved alongside this recurring climate cycle for millions of years, and in some ways, they depend on these periodic extreme events to renew and reset naturally. The concern scientists are raising isn't that El Niño itself is some kind of unprecedented enemy. It's that this particular El Niño, arriving on top of an already destabilized climate baseline caused by human-driven warming, has a much bigger human impact, a much bigger social impact, and a much bigger overall impact on daily life than these natural cycles would otherwise carry on their own. Let's also talk briefly about why the timing of all of this creates additional cause for concern within the United States specifically, beyond just the weather itself. This developing Super El Niño is arriving during a period when America's core weather forecasting and emergency response infrastructure has faced significant strain. Budget and staffing cuts affecting agencies like NOAA, including the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service, have raised real concerns about the country's forecasting, early warning, and overall scientific capacity at precisely the moment when accurate, timely warnings matter most. Layer A, potentially record-breaking climate event on top of a weather service already dealing with reduced capacity, and you have a scenario where the warnings themselves, the very thing that helps communities prepare and stay safe, could become less reliable exactly when they are needed most. We've already seen troubling signs of this kind of gap playing out earlier in the year. In April, 5 tornadoes touched down near Kansas City, including one powerful enough to tear through buildings in the town of Ottawa, Kansas. The local National Weather Service office responsible for forecasting that specific event had issued a forecast just hours earlier predicting no chance of tornadoes at all. That kind of forecasting miss whatever, its underlying cause, becomes a lot more concerning heading into a season where an intensifying Super El Niño could be driving increasingly volatile and unpredictable weather patterns across the entire country. So where does this leave us? A Super El Niño, potentially the strongest ever recorded, appears to be forming in the Pacific Ocean right now, arriving during the hottest baseline global climate conditions humanities has ever experienced alongside an event of this magnitude. In the United States, that likely means a wetter Midwest and West this summer, drier conditions stretching across the Gulf Coast and East Coast, and then, as winter approaches, potentially severe, historic-level flooding sweeping across the southern half of the country, echoing the incredible flood years scientists observed back in 1982 and 1997. Beyond the immediate season, there's a real possibility that some of these shifts don't simply fade away afterward, but instead lock in as a longer-lasting change to regional weather patterns for years to come. Exactly how dramatic, how damaging, and how long-lasting these impacts ultimately turn out to be remains genuinely uncertain, even to the scientists studying this phenomenon most closely. But the scale and trajectory of what's currently building beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean is, by every measure available to researchers right now, deeply unusual. And we are heading into it with a climate system that has never been this warm at the exact same moment an event this powerful has developed. That combination alone is exactly why scientists are speaking up now, well before this El Niño even fully forms, urging communities, policymakers, and ordinary people across the country to pay close attention to what happens next. Let's dig a little deeper into why scientists consider 1982, 1997, and 2015 to be such important reference points, because understanding those past events really helps put the current forecast into perspective. The 1997 and 1998 Super El Niño is widely considered the strongest of the entire 20th century, and it caused an estimated tens of billions of dollars in damage worldwide, from catastrophic flooding across Peru and Ecuador to devastating droughts across Indonesia that fueled some of the worst peatland fires ever recorded at the time. In the United States, specifically, that same event brought powerful storms to California, catastrophic flooding across the southern states, and unusually mild winter conditions across much of the northern half of the country. The 2015 and 2016 event, the most recent Super El Niño before this current one began forming, contributed to widespread coral bleaching events across the world's oceans, disrupted agricultural output in multiple countries, and helped push global average temperatures to what was, at the time, a new record high. If this developing 2026 event genuinely does surpass the intensity of those two historic events, as some scientists now believe is increasingly likely, the scale of disruption could exceed anything documented in the modern historical record. It's also worth understanding a bit more about how researchers actually track and measure these events, because the science behind this forecast is genuinely sophisticated. Scientists monitor sea surface, temperatures across specific, clearly defined regions of the central and eastern Pacific Ocean, comparing current readings against long-term historical averages for that same time of year. They also track atmospheric pressure differences between the eastern and western Pacific, wind patterns along the equator, and a whole range of other oceanic and atmospheric indicators that, together, help researchers estimate not just whether an El Niño is forming, but how strong it's likely to become and how quickly. The specific westerly wind bursts that caught scientists' attention this year are a particularly important early indicator because these bursts of wind essentially act like a trigger, physically pushing warm water that has been building up in the western Pacific back toward the central and eastern parts of the ocean basin. The strength, duration, and timing of these wind bursts historically correlate very closely with how intense the resulting El Niño event ultimately becomes. That's exactly why researchers were able to draw such a direct comparison between this year's wind patterns and the wind event that preceded the historic 1997 Super El Niño. Let's also spend a moment thinking through the practical, everyday implications of a scenario like this for ordinary Americans, beyond just the broad regional weather patterns we've already covered. Farmers across the Midwest and southern states will likely need to adjust planting and harvesting schedules based on shifting rainfall patterns, potentially facing either excessive flooding or unusual dryness depending on their specific location. Water utilities and reservoir managers across the West and Southwest will be watching rainfall totals extremely closely, since a wetter than average El Niño winter can meaningfully help refill reservoirs that have been strained by years of drought, even as it simultaneously raises flood risks in certain areas. Insurance companies and emergency management agencies are almost certainly already factoring this developing forecast into their own planning processes as well. Historically, strong El Niño winters have been associated with a measurable increase in flood-related insurance claims across the southern United States, along with increased demand on emergency services during periods of severe storm activity. Communities in flood-prone areas, particularly along the Gulf Coast and across parts of California that have experienced significant wildfire damage in recent years, may face a particularly challenging combination of risks, given how quickly conditions can shift between drought-driven fire danger and sudden, intense flooding within the same broader climate pattern. There's also a broader economic dimension worth considering here. Severe weather events tied to strong El Niño patterns have historically produced significant agricultural losses, infrastructure damage, and disruption to supply chains, effects that tend to ripple outward well beyond the specific regions directly hit by flooding or drought. A particularly severe or record-breaking event could plausibly contribute to higher prices for certain agricultural commodities, increased strain on infrastructure repair budgets at the state and local level, and broader economic uncertainty in regions most directly affected by extreme weather disruption. Given everything currently known about this developing Super El Niño, from the historically unusual wind patterns detected earlier this year, to the record-warm baseline global temperatures it's forming against, to the potential for lasting climate regime shifts extending years beyond the event itself, this is clearly a story worth watching extremely closely as it continues to develop throughout the remainder of the year. Scientists will be publishing updated forecasts and analysis in the coming months as more data becomes available, and those updates will likely provide much clearer answers about just how intense this event ultimately becomes and exactly which regions of the country should be preparing most seriously for its effects. If this breakdown helped you understand just how significant this developing Super El Niño really could be, make sure to hit like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you want to stay ahead of every major update on this story as it continues developing throughout the rest of the year, make sure you subscribe, because this is a forecast that scientists will be watching extremely closely in the months ahead, and the story is far from finished. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.